There comes a moment in life when what once felt like peace becomes unbearable noise, when the very person you once thought was a gift from God starts to feel like a burden you can no longer carry. It is in that tension between what you feel and what you know that God often begins his work of protection, but the protection does not always look like lightning from the sky or an angel showing up with a flaming sword. Sometimes it's far quieter, far subtler, and yet far more powerful. One of the most ignored signs that God is protecting you from a narcissist is discomfort, an internal disruption, a restlessness in the spirit that refuses to let you settle for deception dressed as destiny. You see, a narcissist does not enter your life shouting, "I am here to break you." No, they come dressed in charm, cloaked in charisma, and soaked in counterfeit light. They say the right things, they mirror your hopes, they even echo your values until they no longer need to. Until the control begins, until the silent erosion of your identity becomes their mission. But long before your mind understands the manipulation, your spirit begins to signal. It's subtle. You feel drained instead of full after interactions. You question yourself more than you question them. You start explaining your worth, your boundaries, your feelings, and you don't even realize that's not love, that's survival. And survival is never the foundation of a godly connection. This is where divine discomfort enters. God will not scream when you are walking into danger, but he will disturb your peace. He will shake the illusion until you can no longer lie to yourself about the truth. That discomfort you feel in the presence of someone you used to admire is not your weakness, it is your wisdom waking up. It is heaven calling your attention to something your heart has been too loyal to see. The voice of the Holy Spirit is not always thunder. Sometimes it's a whisper in your soul saying, "This is not safe, this is not truth, this is not me." But many ignore that signal. Why? Because we've been conditioned to believe that love must be painful, that relationships must require endless suffering, that boundaries are selfish, and that endurance is a virtue even in the face of emotional abuse. So we override the discomfort, we call it a rough patch, we blame ourselves, we spiritualize the suffering, we confuse emotional bondage for divine testing. But what if the discomfort is not your cross to carry, it's your signal to exit? Philosophically, we must understand the nature of evil. Evil does not always show up in grotesque forms, it often arrives wearing beauty, and narcissism is a mask that evil wears to remain undetected. The narcissist projects strength but is fueled by insecurity. They demand loyalty but offer no accountability. They rewrite history to suit their narrative and drain every light that threatens to expose their shadow. So when God begins to pull back the curtain, when he starts disrupting your peace, it is not because he is punishing you, it is because he is trying to wake you up. And waking up is always uncomfortable. Psychologically, the human mind craves patterns. It holds onto the familiar even if the familiar is harmful. Trauma bonds form. The highs and lows of narcissistic abuse trigger chemical responses in the brain that feel like love, but are in fact addiction to chaos. That is why even when God sends the discomfort, we resist. Because freedom feels like danger when you've been groomed to survive in captivity. But here is the truth. God will make you uncomfortable in dysfunction so that you no longer make excuses for staying there. He will stir your spirit until the lie no longer satisfies your hunger for peace. Discomfort, then, is not your enemy, it is your ally. It is the early alarm of heaven. It is the invisible shield of God's grace saying, "You've compromised long enough. I didn't make you in my image for you to be manipulated into silence." And sometimes the greatest act of faith is not in staying and praying for change, but in walking away to protect the sanctity of your soul. There are prayers that God does not answer with a miracle. He answers them with an exit. And let me say this to you with clarity. When you feel that restlessness, that unease that will not let you sleep, do not ignore it. That is not overthinking, that is divine intelligence. That is the fingerprint of God on your consciousness. That is the voice of the divine trying to tell you, you are worth more than this. You are not crazy. You are being called to freedom. You must listen to that inner pull, even when everything on the outside tells you to stay. Because staying with a narcissist costs you more than just time. It costs you your sense of self, your voice, your dreams, your emotional stability, and sometimes even your spiritual connection with God. When God loves you, He doesn't just bless you, He protects you, and protection often begins with disruption. It's the kind of disruption that causes you to stop romanticizing red flags and start honoring your intuition. It's the kind of disruption that says, peace is not found in the absence of problems. It is found in the presence of alignment. If someone constantly makes you feel small, if you are always explaining your worth, if your joy is shrinking and your anxiety is rising, that's not a relationship, it's a redirection. And God, in His infinite mercy, uses that discomfort as a compass. He will never leave you without guidance, but He will also not allow you to stay comfortable in what is killing your purpose. There are times in life when we fight so hard to keep something that God is trying to take away. We plead, we fast, we bargain, we cry. We call it perseverance, we call it loyalty, we call it faith. But often, what we are really doing is forcing something that was never meant to last. Especially when it comes to a relationship with a narcissist, we must understand a critical truth. Not everything that breaks is broken by the devil. Some things are broken by God Himself to save your soul from destruction. When every door slams shut, when communication collapses, when the connection turns toxic no matter how hard you try to hold it together, it may not be sabotage, it may be protection. There is a spiritual mystery in the way God protects. He doesn't always remove the enemy with a shout. Sometimes He simply makes them unreachable. The calls go unanswered, the texts are ignored, the conversations dry up, the energy shifts, and we panic because we think we've lost control. But control is not love, it is fear wearing the mask of attachment. And God is not in the business of feeding your fears. He is in the business of building your freedom. You see, a narcissist's power lies in the illusion of need. They make themselves look like the answer to your prayers, the solution to your loneliness, the cure for your waiting. They come into your life not to grow with you, but to grow at your expense. And when you begin to awaken, when your spirit starts to resist what your emotions once tolerated, they sense it, that's when God intervenes. But His intervention is not always visible. It is not always dramatic. Sometimes He just lets everything fall apart. This is where many people get trapped. They think they are under spiritual attack when in fact they are under divine preservation. Because God, in His wisdom, will not allow you to build a future on the foundation of a lie. You may love with sincerity, but if the other person thrives on deception, God will frustrate every effort you make to keep them, and that frustration is not failure, it is protection in motion. Philosophically, we must grasp that freedom is not found in holding on, it is found in letting go of what keeps us small. And narcissists, by their very nature, shrink you. They do not celebrate your growth, they resent it. They want the version of you that they can dominate, control, and manipulate. So when God begins to elevate you, when He starts to align you with truth, peace, and self-awareness, the narcissist no longer feels at home in your presence. And so they begin to sabotage the connection, and you, not realizing this is divine strategy, try harder, you call more, you apologize for things you didn't do. You shrink yourself to maintain the illusion of harmony. And every attempt you make to fix the dysfunction leads to more pain. Why? Because you are trying to force what God is fighting. Psychologically, this process is brutal. It triggers your inner child. It taps into your fear of abandonment. It forces you to confront your addiction to patterns. You remember the good moments, the moments when their mask fit perfectly, and you think, if I can just be more patient, more kind, more forgiving, it will return to that. But God does not want you to return. He wants you to be reborn, and rebirth begins with the death of what no longer serves your purpose. This is the test. Will you keep chasing a door God has locked, or will you trust that what's behind the next one is better than what you're begging to keep? That is the crossroads of faith, because sometimes God's love shows up in unanswered prayers. Sometimes His mercy wears the robe of separation, and if you are too emotionally invested in the outcome, you will misinterpret the blessing as a betrayal. Understand this: when a narcissist begins to withdraw, it is often because they sense they can no longer manipulate you. Your clarity threatens their chaos. Your strength disturbs their control. Your healing disrupts their cycle. So they retreat or they explode, and in that breaking, God begins to build. The blockages are divine. The separation is sacred. The silence is strategy. But if you keep forcing the connection, texting, chasing, explaining, crying, you are resisting your own deliverance. There is a reason the story of the Exodus didn't include Moses negotiating with Pharaoh forever. At some point, God said, "Let my people go," not because Pharaoh was going to change, but because God wasn't going to wait. And that is the message to someone listening right now. Stop negotiating with your Pharaoh. Stop pleading with someone who only loves you when you're weak. Stop fighting for a bond that survives only when you are broken. If God keeps closing the door, stop trying to climb through the window. Let it collapse. Let it collapse, because the collapse is the beginning of clarity. When it all falls apart, you finally see it for what it truly was. The manipulation, the gaslighting, the performance, the emotional blackmail, it all becomes visible in the ruins, and what you thought was love is exposed as control. That moment is painful, but it is holy. Because it is in that moment that God steps in, not just to remove the narcissist, but to realign you with your destiny. And what follows is the hardest part of all: the silence, the aftermath, the quiet. But in that quiet, if you listen closely, you will hear a new sound, your own voice returning, your peace returning, your focus sharpening, your strength rising. And you will realize that God didn't just protect you from the narcissist, He protected the purpose inside of you that the narcissist could never handle. Before God restores your relationships, He restores your identity. This is not just a spiritual truth, it is a psychological necessity. When you have walked through the valley of manipulation, emotional control, and spiritual distortion at the hands of a narcissist, you emerge wounded in places words cannot reach. You don't just lose peace, you lose yourself. The tragedy is not that the narcissist left. The tragedy is that while they were present, they took pieces of you that never belonged to them. And when God begins to protect you, His first act is not always to bring someone new into your life. No, His first act is to rebuild the foundation of who you are, because you cannot receive love if you don't know you are worthy of it. You see, a narcissist does not seek partnership, they seek possession. They want your admiration without reciprocity. They want your submission without accountability. And slowly, through subtle acts of gaslighting, spiritual manipulation, and emotional erosion, they dismantle your confidence. You begin to doubt your voice. You question your instincts. You shrink in the name of keeping the peace, and the worst part is, they convince you that it's all your fault. They reframe your strength as stubbornness. your honesty as aggression, your silence as disrespect, and before you even notice, the mirror no longer reflects your true self, it reflects their twisted version of who they want you to be. But God does not allow identity theft to go unchecked. When he steps in to protect you from a narcissist, he does not merely remove the external threat. He begins the internal reconstruction, and that process is not always comfortable. Because when you have been surviving on someone else's definition of your worth, learning to define yourself again feels foreign. You wake up asking, who am I without them? What do I like? What do I believe? What do I deserve? And in that fragile moment of rediscovery, God whispers, you are still mine. That whisper is the beginning of restoration. Not the restoration of a broken relationship, but the restoration of your voice, your spirit, your clarity, your dignity. Because God knows that if he sends you into your destiny carrying the wounds of manipulation, the scars will sabotage your progress. You will see red flags as invitations. You will confuse trauma with connection. You will choose silence over truth just to avoid the pain of rejection. And so he halts the process, not to punish you but to prepare you. He presses pause on new relationships so that you can finally have the most important one, the one with yourself and the one with him. Philosophically, this is the journey from fragmentation to integration. When someone has fractured your identity, you cannot operate in power until you have been made whole again. God, in his wisdom, understands that healing is not just emotional, it is existential. It is the recovery of your essence, the ability to walk in a room and not shrink, to speak without apology, to set boundaries without guilt, to look in the mirror and no longer see shame, but strength. And it is in this space of sacred isolation that transformation occurs. No longer distracted by the emotional highs and lows of a toxic bond, you begin to think clearly. You start to see how deeply you were manipulated. How many times you said yes when your spirit screamed no. How often you mistook control for care, and with each revelation the layers fall off, not just the pain, but the false identity you wore to survive. God is not just healing you, he is reintroducing you to who you were before the world tried to redefine you. Psychologically, this process is essential, because unless you reclaim your identity, you will always be susceptible to the same pattern. You will attract what reflects your confusion, not your clarity. That is why God delays the new. He is not being cruel, he is being strategic. He knows that healed people choose differently. Whole people see differently. Restored people love differently. So he waits until you remember that you are not broken. You are not too much. You are not unworthy. You are chosen. You are called. You are already enough. The narcissist tried to convince you that your worth was based on how well you pleased them. God reminds you that your worth is based on the fact that you were made in his image. The narcissist punished you for having emotions. God welcomes your tears as a sign of your humanity. The narcissist twisted scripture to control you. God uses truth to set you free. And in that freedom, your identity is no longer a negotiation. It becomes a declaration. And here is where the restoration shifts. When you begin to walk in your restored identity, the narcissist loses their power. They cannot guilt you anymore. They cannot pull you back with empty promises. You no longer need their validation because you have been validated by truth. And when that happens, you are no longer afraid of being alone because you are no longer abandoned. You are found by the God who refused to let manipulation write your story, and from that place of strength everything changes, your standards rise, your vision sharpens, you don't settle, you don't chase. You don't beg, you attract, you create, you command the atmosphere because you have remembered your authority, and when relationships come again, because they will come, they will be drawn to your wholeness, not your wounds. They will be built on mutuality, not survival, and you will be able to love freely, not fearfully, because God will never give you a relationship that costs you your identity. That is not His way. His blessings do not bind, they release. His gifts do not confuse, they clarify. And if it left you broken, it was not from Him. But if it leads you back to yourself, if it pulls you back to purpose, if it forces you to remember that you were never meant to live small, then it was His hand at work, even in the breaking.